A journalist's job is to be a light in dark places and hold power to account. But over time, this is becoming more and more difficult to do. People's trust in news is waning. The misinformation saturating the internet makes the truth harder to prove. Compounding this, COVID-19 has hit parts of the media industry already struggling to survive, as traditional sources of revenue, like advertising, continue to shrink. In 2020, an estimated 36,000 workers at news outlets in the US lost their jobs, had their pay cut, or were furloughed. The crisis hit local and regional newspapers the most. It's been so acute, many outlets are now forced to consider government financing just to stay afloat. Another trend is also emerging. Media outlets are increasingly setting themselves up as nonprofits to take advantage of better fiscal conditions and philanthropic donations. The landscape is in continuous flux. Some newsrooms, especially in hostile political environments, face pressure to make ends meet and have no choice but to trade funding for editorial control. In Hungary, nearly 80% of the media is now owned by businesses and individuals strongly aligned with government policies. But there are success stories too, of outlets harnessing the power of digital ecosystems to stay in business and grow their audience and revenue. In the Philippines, Rappler, the independent media outlet led by Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa, was able to turn adversity into opportunity. Earlier this year, Ressa was convicted of cyber libel and now faces up to 6 years in prison as part of a trial denounced as Kafkaesque by Reporters Without Borders. Despite this attempt to silence its coverage, Rappler was able to boost its revenue by strengthening its digital presence, cashing in from online subscriptions and opening an online shop. And in Salvador, investigative news outlet El Faro now earns steady revenue from online sales of the books that it produces, as well as music and other artistic products. But stories like these are rare. The economic models underpinning the sustainability of news outlets are being turned upside down. Failing to adapt could lead to editorial meddling, agenda-driven journalism, and a limited ability to hold power to account. So, how do we defend editorial independence? And how can we strengthen and support an industry that is the cornerstone of every free, fair, and informed society?
Hi, I'm Nishant Lalwani, and I am moderating today's session on the impact of financial vulnerability on editorial independence. If that video didn't cheer you up, I don't know what will. More seriously, the situation is dire, and this is not a new situation. Since the turn of the century, media organizations around the world have seen massive threats to their financial sustainability. And that's had a huge impact on their ability to operate and their ability to operate independently. We've got an all-star panel here of journalists, practitioners, academics, donors who have experience in supporting the media in publishing independent news and in holding the line against those threats. So I'm going to dive straight in so that we can have the most time possible with this excellent cast. So I want to talk a little bit first about this problem statement of financial vulnerability, why it's important, and how the two things, how vulnerability financially and editorial independence are linked. We'll then go into a discussion of some of the mechanisms by which this threat has an impact on newsrooms, on the way they're able to operate, on state capture, on the way that they're able to hire. And lastly, we will spend some time on solutions. And what we can do about this to ensure the future isn't as bleak as the last few years have been. We'll try and spend about 45 minutes talking with these panelists directly, and then there'll be time for audience questions. So please do start thinking about what you'd like to ask our panelists today. Lina, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start with you. How are financial vulnerability and editorial independence linked? Why is this important?
Thank you, Nishant. I think one way of answering this question is basically to tell very briefly the story of how we started the Cairo-based news media that I have co-founded with a number of colleagues. We like to call ourselves the children of crisis because the way the newspaper started is that we were kicked out from another major media organization that's privately owned back in 2013. It was a time where there was quite a diversity in media voices, but also it was a time where there was a certain alignment between corporate money and state money when it comes to the media in terms of wanting to have more or less a very pro-military voice in the coverage. And here the important footnote is that the military does take over rule in that summer. So any voices that, naturally claim themselves to be distant, independent from any pole of power, including the military, was deemed basically unacceptable. So what happened in the end is that our work within that media was unacceptable and we were kicked out en masse, 30 journalists. So if we want to think of vulnerability, I guess unemployment is very simply, the straightforward form of precarity in an environment like this. Now, 8 years on, the main reason why Mada stays an important voice of independence, usually called one of the most or the most important voice of independence in Egypt, is that sure enough, there has been unprecedented concentration of media ownership in the hands of different bodies that are associated with power, even if we're still being under the guise of private ownership, so not straightforward state ownership. And that has reflected into an extremely monotone kind of course when it comes to covering the story of Egypt. So there is like just one monotone voice. Sometimes you would even find identical coverage, and I'm not exaggerating here, identical as in same headlines, same leads, same angles to some stories, and then you have us. So that's a short way to by example, time and again say how these two things are super interconnected: financial independence and editorial independence. And the last thing I'll say is that because this has been our experience when we started in 2013, and we'll get into that as this conversation unfolds, because this has been our experience back in 2013, it was very clear for us that when we started our own media, it wasn't going to be just about the content. It was also equally about creating an environment that can renders the production of this content possible and sustainable, and not just sustainable in the sense that we are able to survive, but sustainable also in terms of our journalists being well paid in an environment that is extremely hostile. They have different means of protection, from health insurance to legal protection and so on. And we'll get to that, but just to say that studying the possibilities of the different possibilities within this difficult context of political economy of knowledge production was for us as much as was for us a fundamental exercise as much as the media exercise was also fundamental.
Thank you, Lina. So what I'm hearing is that the threats to the livelihoods of individual journalists, to their well-being, to their ability to operate, ladders up to newsrooms, and ultimately to what you're saying is a monotone sector, monotone coverage now of Egyptian affairs due to that. Khadija, does that chime with your experience? How is financial vulnerability impacting editorial independence?
So I'm from South Africa, where fortunately we have a democratic system and relatively strong democratic institutions. But we have a failing media sector, and that's simply because the business model for news media has failed in South Africa. And it has catastrophic consequences for the ability of journalists to continue doing the job as best as they can. So my experience, Nishant, is different to Lina's in that we don't necessarily have overt state opposition to the media, but what I've experienced and what colleagues, certainly in South Africa and certainly elsewhere in the continent, what they're experiencing is the inability to do their job properly in the face of declining resources, in the face of severe precarity. It is very, very difficult, Nishant, to be planning, the next 3 months of coverage, particularly on public interest issues like access to water, for example, the unsexy issues, when you're not sure if journalists are going to be getting paid next month. It is extremely difficult. So my experience is that financial precarity is an impediment to press freedom. I think that it's intrinsically linked. And what I've seen in my experience running a newsroom, running a startup, is that the ability to actually innovate is also similarly stymied in this environment, because all the energy that we may have used to think about solutions, to think about new ways of doing things, are all being channeled into just surviving, just making sure that we can get through the day, get through the week, just pushing out the stories that are immediately in front of us. So our ability to actually think beyond the immediate moment is severely narrowed. So all of this it has huge consequences for our ability to continue to do journalism well.
Right. If you're always in crisis mode, how can you look to kind of longer term journalism and impact? Thank you, Khadija. Rasmus, I'll come to you next. Obviously, the 5 of us on this panel value editorial independence and understand its power, but there are a number of voices, an increasing number of voices, I'd say, that claim the idea of editorial independence and objectivity is outdated, that it's not a realistic concept for us to uphold in the future. Can you tell us a bit more about whether people in the countries with independent free press, do they value editorial independence? Is this something we should be aiming for?
I mean, I think it's always healthy in any society to have a variety of different kinds of journalism, and committed journalism has a value as well. And sometimes a sort of full-throated, clear editorial line can bring value to public debate as well. But when we look at it from the point of view of public opinion, what people say that they value from news media, the vast majority has a very classic conception of what they seek from journalism. In every country that we do research in, very large numbers of people in most countries, a clear majority, say that they want news organizations to be impartial, to give equal size to different sides, equal time to different sides of an issue, to let a wide range of different views be heard. They also overwhelmingly say in interviews and focus groups that they are concerned by what they see as a mixing of factual, accurate reporting with opinion and commentary, which they often don't really appreciate, at least not as a form of journalism, and often regard as something else entirely, if you will, from journalism. And finally, the key concern that people often express when they say that they have limited trust in news in many countries across the world, including in many democracies, is that they feel that the news media is sometimes subject to undue political or commercial influences, where the view for much of the public is that the news isn't really being produced for them. And it isn't merely a commercial product either sold to them for money, but it is produced by business interest or political interest who are trying to manipulate public opinion in pursuit of other agendas. So there's very clear and very strong, very broad-based public demand for impartial, factually accurate news. There is often a sense of disappointment that people don't feel that they get it. And of course, there are some issues where people make allowances and say, well, in the struggle for social justice, there can be such a thing as false balance, and he said, she said is not the right approach if you have 50 she says and one he said I didn't do it. And that there are issues like human-induced climate change, where the scientific consensus is so clear that to allow people equal time simply because they have an opinion on it, perhaps funded by companies with an interest in the issue or governments with an interest in the issue, is not appropriate. But most issues are not like that from the point of view of the public. And really, people say that they want fairly classic journalism that many journalists would like to offer them: factually accurate, duly impartial, and independent of political and commercial power.
Thank you. So it's clear that this isn't just valuable to journalists, but to audiences and the public as well. Kanbar, thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a bit more about why this is valuable, not only to the public, but to governments? We're getting a sense that there's an increasing emphasis from democratic governments, from donors as well, linked to them, that media sustainability, that media freedom is a more important issue than ever before. So why have we seen that change? Why is this becoming an increasingly important issue for democratic governments?
Well, thank you very much, Nishant. Excuse me, it's great to be joining this panel, and I'm very happy to reflect on the experiences as a policymaker on behalf of the UK government in this really important issue. I think probably 3 points I'd like to make. The first one is just taking a step back and looking at the wider democratic sort of space that we find ourselves, because as we all know, media freedom is intrinsic to democracy and vice versa. But we all also know that globally, democracy is under attack, and you can look at very different metrics to support that. But at the very least, we've seen some people say that for the first time, autocracies, their GDP is now greater than that of democracies. We've also seen institutes like VDEM note that the democratic space globally is shrinking. And from our perspective, there is definitely a strong correlation between democracy on the wane globally and also media freedom being under attack. And there's clearly a case to be said that media freedom is almost the canary in the coal mine, really. It's the first part of the democratic framework which is often under attack by both autocracies, but also insofar as conflict zones are concerned as well. We know that for the last 20 or 30 years, for example, the media card has been the most attacked when it comes to the global sort of breakdown of armed conflict, and it's after professional soldiers that the media cards have been the most attacked. So in that regard, we see a really worrying trend. And if you dig further into it, I know I'm preaching to the converted here. We all believe in media freedom. We all believe in democracy. But it's important to look at some of the evidence for that. For example, recently, research commissioned by the UK government has found that for every percentage point growth in local daily newspaper circulation, electoral turnout on that patch goes up by 0.37 percentage points. So in other words, the more we have insofar as media freedom is concerned, the more evidence we see that aspects of democracy, in this case, electoral turnout, increases. So from that perspective, there's clearly a link. What are we doing about it at the international community? Well, this is my second point really here, that the UK two years ago now with Canada came together and established the Media Freedom Coalition. It's now reached 50 states strong, and it's basically trying to change the narrative around the importance of media freedom at the highest political level. The coalition has issued 18 statements now on some of the most difficult situations in the world globally, where media freedom is under attack, including in situations like China, Russia, and Belarus. But the coalition is also trying to lead by example and encourage and ensure that those members of the coalition have have taken the right steps domestically to lead by example. So in the UK, for example, we have, as a result of joining the coalition, we have launched the first ever UK National Action Plan on safety of journalists. So that's some of the steps that we are trying to take to address that. The third point I'd just like to reflect on is that you touched on why has this become more important last couple of years. There's clearly a growing interest in media freedom at the highest political levels. You can see that through the planning for the US Summit for Democracy that's happening next month. You can see that through the G7 presidency this year for the UK, where media freedom was one of the top issues. And you can also see that through the work of the Media Freedom Coalition. There's no single answer for that, but I would say there's probably two aspects which strike me. One is a growing realization by policymakers that media freedom for too long has been a bit of a niche issue, both in the highest political context, but also within development circles. And this is a point I'm happy to go into a little bit more detail. But also, secondly, I think there's a realization that the development aspect of media sustainability really does need to be focused on, because as we've heard eloquently from the other speakers, we are looking at a almost extinction moment with lots of independent media outlets basically going bust. And we've already seen evidence in some parts of the world where you've got so-called news deserts. So I do feel as though there's a growing realization both within the development context and the political context that media freedom does need to be elevated. Otherwise, the risks both to democracy, but also to our wider values agenda are going to be catastrophic.
Thanks, Kanbar. So Khadija, we've seen, as Kanbar said, that there are a number of governments who are taking an interest in supporting media freedom, such as those that have joined the Global Media Freedom Coalition. There are others, though, that have taken advantage of the financial vulnerability of media organizations to increase their ability to capture those organizations directly or through indirect pressure. Can you talk us through how that mechanism works with state capture and perhaps some examples of where you've seen it happen?
I think the video that we watched before this panel, what's happening in Hungary, I think is highly illustrative of this phenomenon. You mentioned state capture, and of course in South Africa, we've just come out, thankfully, from a period of attempted state capture where several institutions either that are owned by the state were basically siphoned off to business people allied to former President Zuma. And this, came as well with the media component as well, where the public broadcaster was, basically parceled off, as part of consignment, so to speak. But also, the Gupta family created their own media assets as well. They created a newspaper as well as television station, which was sustained by government advertising, lucrative government contracts that basically kept these institutions alive. So it wasn't, it wasn't an act of benevolence for them to create, a media institution as they had, initially presented it as, a Black-owned media institution, because in South Africa, for example, that's still, a major issue for media ownership. But I think that critical point, the ability of governments to funnel advertising revenue to institutions that are deemed friendly to them, is crucial. And we see that in in Latin America, in several states in Latin America. I think Mexico has a particular problem with this phenomenon. But also, I think, coming back closer to where I'm from in South Africa, in Namibia, the Namibian, for example, storied institution, solid history of investigative journalism and holding power to account, have, also experienced years of, a government boycott. And how then do media institutions find themselves new sources of revenue when advertising, advertising revenue is basically being weaponized against them? The truth is, Nishant, when I speak to colleagues, around the world, I spoke to a colleague from Nigeria a few weeks ago. He told me advertising revenue is sub-zero. Those were his words. He said advertising revenue, this is a print newspaper in Nigeria, a large population, biggest economy in Africa. When I speak to colleagues in South Africa, they tell me that, the situation between the start of the pandemic and where we are now is that print advertising revenue no longer exists as a potential revenue item. They've basically had to take that out as a predictable source of revenue. So the urgency, I think, is certainly there. And, as Kanbar says, we are in an existential, we're facing an existential crisis. This is a media extinction event. And it is ripe for the picking for autocrats.
Yes, thank you, Khadija. Lina, you talked earlier about some of the pressures on newsrooms, and in particular on the livelihoods of journalists. Can you talk us through perhaps some of the real trade-offs you've had to make, or you've seen others make, as a result of the financial pressures on media organizations? What are some of the tough decisions you've had to make because of a lack of revenues?
I'm glad that I kept trying to work around alongside my team the pressures that have been exerted on us in order to keep doing what we're doing. So I can't recall specific tough decisions that were, a direct result of dealing with lack of revenues. I recall the opposite, basically. So, for example, one of the main pressures, one of many that independent media, or the very few independent media that exist in Egypt, are facing is you aren't even working in a legal context that allows you to do your business properly, that allows you to, run your revenues, serve your newsroom, develop your work, do R&D, and so on and so forth, because it's a securitized context in the sense that for example, the legalization, authorization, the granting of permits to pursue your work as an independent media is an extremely securitized process, even though there is supposedly a law governing the media, the independent media landscape. But the execution of this law is extremely securitized, which means, people like us can never get a permit, even though we apply and for these permits, and we make it a point that we have no interest in working outside the scope of a restricted law that we actually critique so much in our coverage, and yet we try to abide for it in an attempt to stay within a certain legal environment that can be protective of your economic activities, and yet we're often accused of breaking the law. And an example of a difficult decision is that a couple of years ago we decided to go for a major political investigation, and we knew that it will have a major cost in terms of potential closure of the media, potential arrest, and so on. So that was a difficult decision in the sense that it was just so hard not to publish now that we had everything. And this is, I think, an important part of our ethos, is that we're not after survival per se. Our ethos is, if we exist today, let's do everything possible given the precarity we are living in, because we don't even trust what tomorrow will bring. So it's not, it's not us being, non-visionaries, but it's really working within the scope of the crisis and being children of crisis. And sure enough, what happened when we published that story is that our offices were stormed a few days after. My colleagues and myself were arrested, and there was a major smear campaign in the media, primarily saying that we exist illegally when we had tried so hard to apply for a permit and nobody was even responding to us. So by some sort of a miracle, we're still here. We can try to unpack the miracle at a later stage. But to say that the difficult decisions we have been making were actually ones that go into this opposite direction, even if it will cost us not being able to continue, we would do it because our job is to carry on doing what we're doing. And also we are in the business of trying to turn difficult moments into moments of opportunity. So the moment of our arrest became a major moment of public support. We translated this public support into financial support through, some of our revenue generating activities, which we can talk about at a later stage. So really, it's also about how you constantly try to turn these moments of crisis into moments of possibility. And the last thing I'll say is that when we started turning actively into community support, that was, before a lot of the issues that we started facing were accumulating, but there was a major turning point. Besides the legal issue that I just mentioned, is that also how the digital environment, which is an important center of revenue generation and sustainability for media like us, as we know, became also threatened, in the sense that since 2017, the government started blocking websites. They started with our website, and from there on, they started blocking hundreds of websites, which basically closed the door for advertisement, which made, online payments impossible, and so on and so forth. And this is where we said, okay, let's see what we can do outside this digital sphere while also staying online through the proxies and the VPNs and so on. So again, it's not, for us, it's never a matter of having to take a submissive decision because of the crisis. It's more how the crisis can lead you to, find opportunities, specifically opportunities pertaining to public support at a moment where the public is in dire need for the kind of work we do.
Right, thank you, Lina. And how newsrooms kind of strengthen their relationships with their audiences at this time, I think is going to be a key theme for us. We'll come back to that later in the discussion. Rasmus, I believe Reuters have done some interesting research recently on the sort of hiring and recruitment practices of newsrooms. How have these financial pressures affected the ability of newsrooms to hire and support diverse candidates?
I mean, I think it's clear from our research that the news industry is keenly aware that it's not doing as well in terms of diversity as it ought to do, and that the news industry in many countries doesn't reflect the society that it reports on. In Western Europe, North America, it's essentially still dominated, in particular the senior ranks, by white men like myself, and reporting on a society where not everyone has the same experiences or backgrounds as me, and where people, of course, appreciate seeing people like themselves in the news and making the news. And news organizations are, I think, increasingly sort of reckoning with this, as well as the sort of legacy of often racist, sexist, and classist coverage that some titles have engaged in. And now they'll have to change it. And of course, if you're looking at budgets, doing this during a time of revenue downturn doesn't make things easier. It would be easier to change the composition of your staff if money was rolling in like there was no tomorrow. And I think it's essentially placed many organizations in a situation where they can only do if they make hard choices. And doing some things will necessitate not doing other things. And change sometimes is also requires and necessitates people letting go, including people like myself, and stepping back and creating opportunities for others. So I think the revenue situation doesn't make this easier for news organizations. I would hasten to add that I don't think we should confuse commercial success with delivering on diversity. I mean, it is worth remembering that the commercial high point of sort of Western European and North American newspaper publishing was in the 1990s, and that doesn't stand as sort of the pinnacle of inclusivity and equity in terms of who led the industry and how society was covered. So there is a link here. It does make things more difficult, but fundamentally, I mean, I hope that editors and executives across the world, would listen to what Lina just said and embrace the approach of Mada Masr. Given we exist today, let's do everything we can.
Thank you, Rasmus. Why don't we talk a little bit more about solutions? Yeah. We've understood how important this problem is and how it's affecting the newsrooms that we've discussed. So I guess, Khadija, the first question is, how do we get more money to media organizations if money is what they're lacking? You are the head of programs for the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Can you tell us a bit more about what the vision is there and how that'll work?
So the International Fund is born out of the realization of the crisis and the urgency of the crisis, the realization of the urgency and the understanding that we urgently need solutions to keep media alive in real time, to understand that we have perhaps a 10-year window to just ensure the news media exists, and within that 10-year window, to rebuild the infrastructure supporting a global free media in order for us to understand how the media, will sustain itself going forward. But we can't just sit back and wait for some of those, for example, regulatory reform to happen, because as you and I both know, Nishant, governments move really, really slowly. And when there are corporate interests involved, they're likely to move even slower. So in the meanwhile, we have real implications for how we understand the world around us, for how we hold power to account, for how democratic societies will be going forward. And that's why we need to urgently find new money to keep media alive. Therefore, the International Fund for Public Interest Media was born. It is a brand new organization. Please don't send us funding requests right now. We're still trying to work it out. But basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to find new sources of funding and channel that through an independent multilateral institution to where it's needed most. So we're going to governments, persuading them, first of all, that news media is a public good, that in order for us to come together as human society in this moment of profound crisis, we have to understand that we cannot survive as a species without news media, without this, because news media allows us to understand what is, who we are and what we're doing. And in order to do that, we need the news media. So we're going to governments, particularly governments with development aid budgets, and we're persuading them at the beginning to allocate at least 0.5% of the development aid budgets to news media development. So essentially, and this is really, really important, Nishant, we're not trying to rechannel existing funding for media. We need more funding. The moment requires us to dig deep and to find new sources of funding. Therefore, we're starting off with the governments. We're asking them to, it's basically asking them to take a step back and think, okay, news media is important. We need news media to survive. How are we going to factor this in the way we spend our money? Right. And that's, where we're beginning, but we're also appealing to the tech companies. We're also appealing to corporates. We're appealing to philanthropy. We're asking them to relook at their budgets, to find, money for news media at this time. So where this money is coming from, I've been heartened, Nishant, in that in all our meetings, we really have to make the case for this. People, and I think whether we speak in corporate spaces or in government, people understand that, there's something drastic has to happen. It's just a matter of trying to understand how, when that happens. But I think, my appeal to particularly policymakers listening here today is that we need this to happen immediately. We really can't differ much longer.
Thank you, Khadija. So just as Lina was saying, she's been turning moments of crisis into moments of opportunity. Perhaps we can do the same for media funding and media support. Kanbar, how are government donors and politicians responding to this crisis? You talked a bit about the G7 and about the importance of this on the political agenda, but what are some of the concrete steps you think that government donors can take to support media organizations at this time?
Thanks, Nishant. I think my first observation is that we are at the early stages, I would say, as the international community in the form of states are recognizing this problem. But we are certainly making progress in recognizing it. And I say that because if you look at the language, for example, the G7 has secured this year, in contrast to other language that may have been secured at other multilateral fora and other in the past, there's been a change. So I'll just read out the first two lines of it here. We recognize the importance of improving media sustainability, increasing access to independent and diverse media, and supporting journalists. So in that regard, there is a growing acknowledgement that this is a problem and we need to do something about it. In terms of what that something looks like, we've heard already from Khadija one potential solution, which is the International Public Fund for Independent Media. And I would, without wishing to sort of, I know it's a very sophisticated and nuanced proposal, but in basic terms, it's asking states to put more money to resolve the situation. So that's sort of throwing the money at it solution. I'll be very frank as a policymaker to make the point, it's obvious, but I'll make the point that in the current fiscal climate, where we, for example, in the UK, have had to reduce our overseas development assistance from 0.7 to 0.5, we are no longer really in the context of having the resources to throw money at this. So that's a challenging context for decision makers and policy makers, where the public purse globally is under increasing pressure. But it's worthwhile those discussions continuing, because it's a long agenda, and the early we can start now, hopefully policymakers can be aligned to and more supportive when the physical situation changes. But I think it's important to acknowledge the constraints there. There are also other solutions out there, I should add. We, within the Media Freedom Coalition, we are trying to develop a new process whereby we look at updating the media freedom, so the media development principles in this area. Because from our perspective, as has been noted already, within the context of development, media freedom has been a bit of a niche issue. So we want to update these sectoral principles here, because too much support for media has been piecemeal. It's not being done through a coherent or coordinated focus. And we are trying to update the principles that were agreed by the OECD in 2011. And we hope that by updating them, we can really bring the importance of media freedom, the importance of media sustainability into the heart of the development sector. That's obviously, again, going to be a long-term process, but we hope that by doing that, it can make a difference. My final thought in this is that we have been supporting particular programs with the aim of trying to focus on knowledge sharing across the globe, but also improving the ability of independent media to be more viable as a business. So, for example, we have a program in the UK called Primed. It's a 3-year program supporting development of healthier information ecosystems across the globe, in particular Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Sierra Leone. We think that's from our perspective, we think that's a first of its kind really program to address this issue. We're very happy to share experiences on that. But my final thought on this is that in the spirit of humility, I should say that this is a global problem. It also affects media outlets in the UK. So in that regard, we in the UK, we don't have the answer to all of this. Our own media outlets are also experiencing these challenges. I think the point Khadija made is that we do need a holistic approach to this, including addressing one of the primary causes of this, which is the migration of ad revenue to online, where, according to some people, that ad revenue has halved for independent media in the last 10 years. That's so we do need to think about how these the tech platforms, these sort of, I think some people call them POPs, these publicly owned private spaces, how they can be used as part of the solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanbar. Khadija, I want to come back to you actually, because what Kanbar is saying is that the UK is fiscally constrained, and despite this being a financial problem, they're not in a position to put money into a solution. Is that the same with other donors? What's been your response to fundraising? Because you were saying that actually donors are getting the idea that this is a financial problem and needs a financial solution. So what's been your response from other governments?
Nishant, I think we've been surprised that actually, we've had really encouraging conversations with governments around the world, and even governments who aren't, who don't have existing programs for media support. And I think that that's the point of the International Fund, where we actually are trying to appeal to governments, particularly who don't have existing programs of media support, to try to allocate new resources. So our experience, knowing that, of course, the UK is in a particular context right now, but I think that around the world, we've been encouraged, I would say, by the conversations that we're having. I think that there's a growing realization of the importance of news media, and certainly I think that the decision by the Nobel Committee to award the CS Prize to two journalists, is testimony to that. There's this realization that we do indeed need to do something.
Thank you. So obviously governments and donors are one source of potential revenue here, but another source are audiences. And Lina, you were referencing earlier some of your efforts to generate reader revenue through membership and other models. Can you talk us through, how your progress has been on that front?
Sure, but I'd like to circle very quickly back to things mentioned by Khadija and Kanbar on government funding, also to connect to questions of audience-centric revenue generation. I think it's amazing to see that the discourse on government, or global support to media has become quite political, in the sense that, media is increasingly seen as an important cornerstone at the intersection of social movements and civil society in the state ecosystem, and not to mention when states are grabbed by autocratic governments, and that this is also a way to see the stability of a certain ecosystem, which matters to donor governments. In tandem with that, I think it's important to see the media development agenda evolve to avoid past challenges, past mistakes, such as favoring programmatic funding to core funding. We all know that if we think of media as such a cornerstone element in civil society, we need to think of institutional development, because institutional deficit is a major challenge for the civil society movement in countries like ours, and because a successful enterprise needs a proper institution behind it. It just doesn't. It doesn't need just only the good content or the consistency. All of that is a matter of institutional development, and here is where core funding is very, very central. And also avoid such things as north-south training, which we all are cognizant of how much money has been reserved and exhausted in such enterprises that do not really have quite some positive returns on the media movements in different parts of the world. But in tandem with all of that was this super politicized money, and we all know that even if it's core funding, even if it's a percentage of developmental funding, there is a mandate behind it that can have different variations, from countering terrorism to dealing with the migration question and so on. And that's why in tandem to that, we believe that in order to go back to the main question of this panel, independence should be achieved with a hybrid model where the audience comes in. And audience is the audience is very central, is a very central element of our financial sustainability and broader sustainability at Mada. And that has been translating into two main activities. One is a membership club. So again, think The Guardian. We don't put any content behind the paywall because we are in a dire situation where there isn't a diversity of media voices. So the content needs to stay available, and people who have financial capability and can be felt and made responsible for the sustainability of this media, they should pay, and we should offer them different tiers, and we should be able to give them different small extra perks for being part of this close family that is making this media possible. So that's and very briefly how we are running our membership program. And in parallel to that, we have editorial services, which are more directed towards institutions who would like to commission us to do translation work, editing work, basically tapping into the skill set that they see so well in the published content, and which, again, and this is back to audience, they feel like commissioning it to us because it's a form of support as well. So it's a dual thing always. It's when it comes to audience support, it's a statement of support, but it's also a very utilitarian type of support. People support it because they need the information, they need the service, they need to see this thing survive, basically.
Thank you, Lina. Rasmus, Lina talked about, her experiences of reader revenue. How does that translate to other places where you've done research? And what are we looking for in terms of the key parameters around how much audiences can pay, how much they're willing to pay, how much they need to pay to be sustainable, to have sustainable media organizations these days?
Well, I'm glad that we're focusing on that. I think we need to remember the context that the majority of independent journalism everywhere has always primarily been funded by commercial for-profit entities competing in a marketplace. And that while it is the case that there are some countries in which governments has made a difference for the better by supporting public service media or by providing direct and indirect support for independent private media, that is rare. And even in the countries where those arrangements are most generous, they are often a very small part of the overall media market. And of course, in many more countries, government's role has been for the worse, and resources that were presented as if they were a form of support were really instruments of media capture and ways of trying to manipulate and control the media. So I think it's very important to look at the market also because, frankly, as Kanbar alluded to, when policymakers say we don't have resources for it, what they really mean is we have decided other things are more important. It is a purely political question, a question of support in the public and support amongst elected officials, whether we want to make collectively binding decisions to invest public resources in supporting independent journalism. We can do this domestically, we can do it internationally. There are options available. Whether we do it or not is a separate matter. The resources, of course, are there. There are 2 trillion spent a year on fossil fuel industry subsidies. The UK government expenditure last year, I think, was about £800 billion. That's more than the global total revenues of Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple combined. So these are choices, and these are for citizens and their elected officials to make. Whether or not we make those choices, we need to look at the marketplace. And of course, I think the headline figures of what we're seeing right now, and I'll just show a few slides to illustrate them, is, first of all, that the news industry historically was heavily reliant on advertising revenues in the online space, where most of us spend far more time with the products and services offered by large platform companies such as Google and Facebook and their smaller competitors. Advertisers are moving their budgets. And as a consequence, now a small number of US-based large tech companies account for a very large share of global digital advertising revenues. And this, of course, challenges the business model of established publishers and new entrants alike. So increasingly, including online, publishers are moving to reader revenues. We are seeing a move to both subscription models and membership models. And by now, we do have a number of markets, mostly in the global north, where a significant minority of the population are paying for online news. About 1 in 5 internet users in the United States about the same in some Northern European countries. But also, of course, important to recognize that even in many high-income democracies, France, Germany, and the UK, it's still only about 1 in 10, or in sometimes fewer, who pay for online news. And in much of the global South, there are basically almost no meaningful share of the public who's paying for online news. And of course, also a situation where many publishers have not even really tried charging for online news. So reader revenue is increasingly important, but also it's a battle that's one heart or mind at a time, and often starting from a situation where many of us have been accustomed for 20 or 25 years to have access to things for free online. And also, frankly, outside of the context of countries such as Egypt, where the supply of genuine independent journalism is less than abundant. In free countries, most of us have access to an abundant supply of perfectly acceptable news that's free at the point of consumption from both commercial and public service providers. So it really requires very clear editorial value and differentiation to convince people to pay for things where they have so many substitutes. So I think if we think about what this means for the industry, we need to sort of contend with the fact that top-line revenues are going to be shrinking commercially for some time to come, because digital is a more competitive and unforgiving marketplace. And that is likely to be a sort of a few winners, many losers scenario, where the most distinct outlets may thrive, both editorially and commercially, but many others will struggle. So if that's the revenue side, I think the other thing we need to think about is essentially what kind of editorial bang do we get for our bucks? And if the dynamics around advertising in particular, and to some extent reader revenue too, are quite challenging, advertising very challenging, reader revenue, encouraging for some, but not necessarily going to work for everyone, I think it really begins to matter how much journalism we actually get for the money that the industry generates. We have some estimates of this, historic ones. So television, of course, historically was the largest part of the media industry. And in the UK, it's estimated something like 4% of television industry revenues are invested in journalism. Radio is still very important in many parts of the world, in particular in terms of reaching rural communities. In the UK, it's estimated something like 13% of radio industry revenues are invested in journalism. Newspapers, of course, are the mainstay of the profession, and the news media industry historically has been the biggest investors in independent professional journalism. In the UK, it's estimated about a quarter of newspaper industry revenues are invested in the newsrooms. But I think encouragingly, while the top line revenues are almost certain to shrink, I think it's noteworthy just to think about what the profile looks like for digital born news sites. This is a very heterogeneous space, but we surveyed a number of news organizations across the world last year. And amongst the digital-born news sites, the majority of them report that they're spending 50% or more of their revenues on their newsroom. So I think that the picture here is challenging. We see advertising money moving elsewhere. Some are staying with news, but not much. We are seeing some readers willing to pay for news, but not many. And it's an incremental battle to win people over one at a time and retain them. And it's working for some, but it won't work for every title necessarily. These are challenging propositions, but we should also, I think, recognize that there are opportunities here, including running very lean organizations where a much larger share of the revenues generated are invested in actual journalism, which is what we care about, right? We don't care from a public interest point of view about the other 96% of the television industry as revenues. That's fine for entertainment and it's fine for shareholders, but that's not what the future of journalism is about. The future of journalism is about generating enough revenues that people can cover the cost of doing independent journalism to inform the public so people can make up their own minds about things that matter in their lives.
Thank you, Rasmus. Really fascinating data, and hopefully a kind of positive outlook in terms of, a lowering amount of money is actually required to do public interest media if we can get the balance of those costs right. So a fascinating discussion so far. I'm conscious that we have a number of excellent questions from the audience. I'm going to move to some of those now. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'll address as many of them as possible. Apologies to those that we don't get to. So we've been talking a bit about audience revenue, and Rasmus, you talked about few winners, many losers. One of the questions we have from our audience is, how can we bolster local media outlets in a winner-takes-all media environment? And I guess the underlying this question is just the idea that, you know, if you are relying on readers, and as Rasmus showed, a minority of people pay for news, then does that mean that some news outlets succeed, but many fail? And in particular, there's an emphasis in this question on local media outlets. What's the prospects for them if the future of media is audience revenue? Anyone want to take that question?
I mean, I can take a stab at it. I mean, I think there is a very fundamental sort of thing that's changed, which is that, I mean, crudely put, in much of the Western world, local newspapers were run as if they were smaller versions of national and international titles. So, you know, the Times of X was essentially a smaller version of the New York Times, and it tried to offer everything, and it was based on the same business model. And frankly, often they were more successful than the bigger ones relative to the size of the communities they served. This is not the world we live in anymore, because the inhabitants of town X can get excellent national and international reporting from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, from the Wall Street Journal, from the FT, from the Economist, from many other titles. So they don't really need that from their local newspaper. Advertisers can buy local advertising from Facebook, from Google, from any other large platform. So they don't really need the Times of X either to reach citizens in that town. And suddenly the local newspaper or news provider has to be truly local in terms of the information it provides, and has to make its living by serving the readers and citizens of that town or that area, rather than serving advertisers, and rather than by sort of packaging a wider bundle of content. And this is very different. And I'm seeing, you know, both legacy titles developing in that direction. I'm very impressed by the work done by James Mitchinson in the Yorkshire Post, for example, in this area. We're also seeing digital-born new entrants like the Lincolnite in the northeast of England, for example, you know, building new, truly local sites. But I think we just have to accept that this is very different from what local newspapers were in the past. What can we do? Well, I mean, most of the change, I think, has to come from within the profession industry. I don't think the cavalry is coming to the rescue. If someone wanted to send the cavalry, you know, public service notices would be a good start. Local governments spend a lot of money on advertising. This could be spent with local public interest media. Some local government authorities issue their own newspaper-like publications. I wonder whether that money could be spent better elsewhere. So there are steps that can be taken, but fundamentally, I think the change has to come from within. There are lots of people who can help journalists and editors, but at the end of the day, I think journalists and editors have to sort of be the change that they want to see.
Yeah, thank you, Rasmus. Staying on this theme of reader revenue, another question from the audience is this: will reader subscription models lead to what President Obama called echo chambers? So people paying to read the news they agree with, or that reinforces their worldview rather than different opinions. Lina, in your experience of working with audiences and generating reader revenue, is this the case?
I think it's a very interesting question. And, you know, I always say that I will never work with, again, a model where I put the content behind the wall and put it up for subscription for reasons related to the political ecosystem in which I work, where, you know, there isn't even a diversity of media in such a way where we can afford to do that. But also, this is the kind of question that expands this argument a little more to just beyond the context in which I work, in the sense that I prefer a membership model, because a membership model is a form of political investment as opposed to commodification of the media. So I pay to support this media while I'm exposed to everything. So that's one way to answer this question. The other way to answer this question is that the reason why I believe it's important to try as much as possible to sustain some sort of a hybrid model that also, you know, possibly include public funding when public funding is available and is well politically engineered and is not problematic as such, is that you also don't want to fall into the reader's tyranny, where you end up, you know, serving this specific community that likes you and that supports you. And this is something that we experience very closely at Mada. A lot of the times people feel that we because we are also, the only one there doing this kind of work, that we should totally represent their views, their opinions, the people who support us. And sometimes we have to remind them that we're also here to challenge them. We're also here to show them things that they are not seeing. So just to say, we're very sensitive to this question of echo chambers. Just to say that in general, my preference for membership over subscription models is because we also need to remember that media is, as you mentioned, Rasmus, is a public good and is not a commodity that you pay for directly as such, and your choice to support it is a form of political investment rather than buying a good, really.
Thank you, Lina. We've talked quite a lot about theoretical barriers here and theoretical solutions, but one audience member asked, can we share examples of news outlets which have shown innovative or best practice in turning around their financial fortunes and safeguarding their futures? And I would just like to open this up to all the panelists. Are there any news organizations you admire for having turned around their fortunes, other than yours, of course, Lina, with the many issues and barriers that have been put in front of you? There's a couple. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can. I'm continually inspired by Malaysia Kini in Malaysia, biggest news website in that country, that also does not have it easy with the state. Its owners and founders have found themselves on the wrong side of the law several times. But they're just fantastic. They're absolutely fantastic. They publish in 3 languages with a very small team, in relation to the work that they do. But also, what they're trying, the things that they're trying to do in terms of centering the audience, in terms of actually innovating with the idea of, the kind of like product-centric approach to news media is fantastic. I visited them a few years ago, and they took us through some of their own innovations, where they were finding a subscription to some of the more advanced analytics tools to be quite expensive, which I found running a newsroom as well. So you have the basic Google Analytics, but then on top of that, if you want to take out an advanced Chartbeat or Parsley account, it is quite expensive, to understand reader behavior quite closely. So they got their dev team together and they made their own tool. They created their own tool, and their approach to to actually answering big financial problems, by basically growing their own timber, so to speak. It really inspires me, and I think that I continually think of them when I think about the potential for newsrooms going forward. And another organization, relatively much larger than the kind of organizations that we've been talking about today, is also, I think, the Agora group in Poland, who Poland's also having particular issues with regulation and regulating the media in the state, certainly not showing the most democratic tendencies at the moment there. But I think that it's what it's done with its own subscription models, but also in terms of also just creating other forms of content to support the public interest journalism around that is really, really inspiring. And they started off as a newspaper in the 80s, and it's grown into a great conglomerate. So I think that those two really do inspire me.
Thank you, Khadija. Very inspiring. Are there others who want to share stories of media organizations they admire?
I'll offer a few, because I think it's really important in a very challenging situation that we embrace what I think climate activists call fact-based hope, that we can be simultaneously in a situation where things are really, really difficult, but where there are also reasons to be inspired and draw inspiration from people's success. So I would mention just a few titles. Other examples in Europe, Mediapart in France have built a growing subscription business around investigative journalism. and converted the organization into a nonprofit to retain its editorial independence in a country where problems of political and commercial interference in editorial are not unknown of. El Diario in Spain, a mix of advertising based and membership based, again, a liberal democracy, but not a country where it's been entirely unknown for sort of big business or governments to sort of throw their weight around. Very inspiring success to see there. In less sort of robustly democratic parts of Europe, 444 in Hungary, to sort of supplement Khadija's example from Poland, a digital born, again, site based on membership to ensure their independence. We can think of others, Daily Maverick in South Africa, a combination of print and digital, membership-based again. Denik N in Slovakia, membership-based, subscription-based again. And then there are titles, of course, in the global south. Khadija mentioned Malaysia Kini. We should mention Rappler, that Maria leads so courageously. And in India, while often facing quite difficult situations, both politically and commercially, I think we should recognize digital-born entrants such as Scroll, The Wire, The Quint, The Ken, as really, really interesting and important additions to the Indian media landscape. Not all of them are finding an easy path forward. No one is really in the commercial space, but all of them are doing really important journalism, and I think are showing how much can be done also with limited resources in challenging environments. And I think everyone can draw inspiration from that.
We can, and as we just finished there, we're unfortunately running out of time. I think that's an excellent and inspiring note to end on, that despite the many barriers, structural, political and otherwise, that are faced by media organizations, that we are seeing green shoots, we are seeing success stories, we are seeing new models of independent financing like the International Fund for Public Interest Media. We are seeing more government interest in both media freedom and media sustainability. As Kanbar was saying, we are seeing inspirational leaders like Lina turn moments of crisis into moments of opportunity for their organizations where they can. And so despite the clear and declining revenues for many media organizations, I personally have a lot of faith that together we can get through this, that we can innovate, and that we can keep pushing the boundaries of what media is and how much our peers and audiences value that new form of media. So on that note, I want to say thank you to Khadija, to Lina, to Rasmus and Kanbar, who provided some terrific insights during this discussion and have given their time to this really important issue. And I'll hand back to the Trust Conference to take you to the next part of the agenda. Thanks, everyone.